Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on something truly foundational. We're diving into the final monumental speeches of a leader who is facing his own legacy, his own mortality, and trying to lay out a blueprint for a nation that has really only ever known two things: slavery and wandering.
That's exactly right. Our sources today are centered on the Book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch. And it's so crucial because, as you said, it's basically the final constitution for this new nation.
And the name itself, Deuteronomy, gives us a clue, doesn't it?
It does. It comes from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and it means second law.
Which, when you hear that, you immediately think, okay, a second law. Why? Did they already get the law at Mount Sinai? What makes this one different?
That's the key question. It's not really new legislation, like a whole fresh set of rules. It's more of a deep re-explanation. It's a reinforcement of that original covenant. But it's tailored for a brand new audience.
Because the original generation
Was gone. They had died in the wilderness. So this new generation, the one that's about to actually cross the Jordan River, they needed to hear it fresh. They needed to hear it persuasively with all the stakes laid out. Our sources call it lie preached, not just law taught.
I like that. Law preached. It's less like reading a legal document and more like a high-stakes rhetorical performance.
Absolutely. The tone is completely different. This is Moses standing on the edge of everything they've worked for, and he has to get this new generation to understand not just the rules, but the passion, the history, and the terrifying consequences if they fail.
And the setting just adds to that urgency.
It really does. They're on the plains of Moab. The entire book, all these speeches, they take place over just a few weeks. This is right before Moses' death, around 1406 BC.
And the consensus on authorship is pretty solid, right?
Incredibly strong. It's attributed squarely to Moses, and that's supported later by, major figures like Jesus Christ, Peter, Stephen, Paul. They all point back to Moses as the source. And he grounds it in history by consistently calling Mount Sinai by its other name, Horeb.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before Moses even gets to the future, to the new blueprint for their society, he does something fascinating. He forces them to look backward. He takes them on this sometimes frustrating trip down memory lane.
He has to. He has to explain exactly why their parents wandered for 40 years and never ever made it to the finish line.
This historical recap seems essential.
It is, because it establishes two core truths right from the beginning. First, God's absolute faithfulness, and second, Israel's, their profound capacity for failure.
And he opens with something that's it's shocking, right? In Deuteronomy chapter 1, it's the journey that should have been.
Yes. The normal travel time from Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, to Kadesh Barnea, basically the southern doorstep of the Promised Land, should have been just 11 days.
11 days. We're talking about, 150 miles?
Something like that. It's a short hop for an organized group. But, of course, they took 40 years to cover that distance.
And that contrast is intentional.
Oh, completely. That huge gap between the short distance and the incredibly long time. It's a powerful symbol Moses uses right away. It shows the failure was purely spiritual. It was driven by unbelief and rebellion.
So here's where it gets really interesting. Moses recounts how God had already made them as numerous as the stars. He was ready to hand over the land, and that whole generation just stumbled right at the finish line at Kadesh Barnea.
And he even mentions some of the internal problems they were having before that, disputes among the people that required him to appoint judges. But when it was time to actually go in and take the land, they lost their nerve.
They insisted on sending spies first.
Right, and our sources point out that this was the people's idea, not God's direct command. Now, sending spies wasn't necessarily a sin in itself.
But God knew them. He knew their hearts.
Yeah. He knew exactly what would happen. He knew that the sight of these huge, fortified cities and giants, the Anakites, the Rephaches, would completely overwhelm them. And this was even after God had explicitly promised, I will go ahead of you and fight for you.
He reminds them, the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son.
I mean, what a powerful image. He's reminding them of decades of providential care, but they just couldn't trust it in that moment. They listened to the bad report about cities with walls that reached as high as heaven itself.
And it wasn't just fear, was it? It turned into something much worse.
It did. It morphed into an outright character assassination of God. And that's the core transgression Moses hammers home. They complain in their tents, and they accused God of bringing them out of Egypt because he hated them.
Just think about the audacity of that. After everything, the plagues, the Red Sea, the manna, They accuse their deliverer of pure malice.
That violation of God's goodness, his character, that was the unforgivable sin for that generation. It was a complete failure of the loyalty test.
And the consequence was swift.
Absolute and immediate. God vowed that this evil generation, specifically the men of military age, 20 and older, would not see the good land. The result was 38 more years of just wandering, waiting, until every last one of them had died out.
It's just an incredible lesson on the seriousness of failing to trust God's promises.
Especially when you've already seen his power firsthand. But the consequence, the recrimination, it didn't even stop there. It extended all the way to the top.
To Moses himself. Even he was excluded. It says so, right in Deuteronomy 1.37. He forfeited that earthly inheritance too.
And in these final speeches, Moses makes no attempt to hide his own guilt. He owns it. His failure, when he lost his temper and struck the rock instead of speaking to it, that meant he too forfeited the right to enter Canaan.
And our sources make an interesting distinction here, a contrast between someone like Abraham and Moses.
Yes, it's like a graduation analogy. If Abraham, who waited patiently for decades and stayed steadfast, was the valedictorian who got the full reward,
Then where does that put Moses?
Moses is kind of like the salutatorian. I mean, an incredible leader. He mediated the entire covenant. He got them right to the border, but he lost his patience at the very end. The sin wasn't just hitting a rock. It was a public failure to honor God's holiness. He inserted himself into the equation.
So it was a penalty for a public professional failure at a critical moment.
Exactly. But, and this is a fundamentally crucial point our sources make, this exclusion from the earthly land did not mean a rejection of his ultimate salvation. Moses was still God's servant. His heavenly reward was secure. The text uses this to show how serious disobedience is, even for the best leaders.
Okay, so with all those past failures laid out on the table, Moses then pivots. He turns to their initial successes, showing the new generation that God's faithfulness is ready to break through with them. This is the conquest of the Transjordan.
Right. And these victories immediately show Yahweh's sovereign control over all nations, not just Israel. Before any fighting starts, God gives them very specific instructions.
Don't mess with Edom, Moab, or Ammon.
Exactly. Don't harass them. Don't be hostile. God recognized them as relatives, descendants of Esau and Lot, and he makes it clear, I have already given them their territory.
He repeats that phrase, I have given, 3 times.
Yes, to confirm that every nation's border, every piece of territory, is under his direct control. So Israel has to detour. They can only purchase food and water from the Edomites. They're forbidden from provoking Moab.
And the reason is that God had already cleared out the previous inhabitants for them.
Right. He'd already destroyed powerful people like the Emites, who were as tall as the giants they feared, and given that land to Lot's descendants. It shows God was acting as the supreme landlord long before Israel even arrived.
Which leads them to their first real military test against Sihon, the king of the Amorites.
And Moses offers peace terms first. Simple passage through his land, promising to stay on the main road.
But Sihon refuses.
And the text says this refusal was divinely orchestrated. It explicitly says God had made him obstinate and stubborn so that he could be delivered over to Israel. It's predictive prophecy being fulfilled in real time. God used the enemy's own corruption and pride as the mechanism for their defeat.
That is just profound. God engineers the enemy's own resistance to bring about his plan.
And the victory was total. They seized all his cities, put them under divine judgment. The only things they kept were the livestock and the plunder.
And this all builds up to the capstone of the campaign, the conquest of Og, king of Bashan.
This is the big one. This speaks directly to the fears of that first generation. They were paralyzed by the fear of giants and walled cities, and now God delivers 60 fortified cities and a literal giant into their hands.
This is where Moses drops that incredible verifiable fact.
Yes, the size of Og's iron sarcophagus, or his bed. It was 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide.
That's just massive.
It is. And that detail isn't just a fun fact. It was physical, historical proof. The message was clear. The giants your fathers feared were real? Yes. But our God is demonstrably greater.
So with this huge territory east of the Jordan now secure, Moses immediately moves to distribute it.
He does. The land is assigned to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. This is their inheritance.
But it comes with a major string attached.
A huge one. This was not a time to settle down and relax. Moses strictly commanded their warriors. You must cross the Jordan fully armed and fight alongside your brothers until the entire land is conquered. Only then can you return to your inheritance.
It's a test of national solidarity.
Absolutely. They couldn't put their own comfort ahead of the national mission. And it's right at this moment that Moses formally commissions his successor, Joshua. He tells him, "You have seen what God did to these two kings. He will do the same to all the kingdoms where you are going. Do not be afraid. The Lord your God will personally fight for you."
And the section ends with that poignant plea from Moses. He begs God to let him cross over, just to see the land.
It's a powerful moment, and God's reply is just so final. Enough of that. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. His sin meant he could only see the land from a mountaintop. His final earthly task was to prepare Joshua. This whole recap is designed to drill one thing into the new generation. Victory requires complete, trusting obedience.
Which is the perfect setup for part 2. Moses shifts from history to the Constitution itself, the laws that will define them as a people. And he starts with a stark warning against corruption in chapter 4.
And the very first command he gives is arguably the most important principle for biblical authority in the entire text. Deuteronomy 4.2.
Right.
Do not add a thing to what I command you, nor subtract from it.
It's about preserving the integrity of the law. No human tampering.
Exactly. It prevents legalism, adding a bunch of extra burdensome rules, and it prevents relativism watering down the law to make it easier. They have to keep it precisely as God delivered it, no edits allowed.
And a huge part of keeping it pure was remembering what happened at Horeb.
Yes, he reminds them of the uniqueness of that revelation. They heard speech, a voice from the fire, but they saw no form.
And that's critical.
It's the whole basis for the prohibition against idolatry. God intentionally revealed himself as a voice, not an image, to show that he is abstract, spiritual, and utterly beyond human representation. He can't be contained in a statue.
So the ban on making any image, human, animal, whatever, is rooted in the idea that God is fundamentally incomprehensible.
That's the insight for us too, isn't it? We might not be carving wooden idols, but we can fall into the same trap of trying to limit God, to reduce him to our own comfortable ideas. The moment we think we've got him all figured out, we're creating a conceptual idol.
Moses even brings up his own exclusion again here as a warning.
He does. He uses his own failure to prove that absolute undivided loyalty to God is non-negotiable, and he reminds them of God's character. He's consuming fire and a jealous God.
And we need to be clear about that word jealous.
Yes. In the Bible, God's jealousy isn't pettiness or insecurity. It's his absolute zeal for righteousness that flows from his perfect holiness. He simply will not share allegiance. If they turn to idols, they will be scattered.
But it's not all warnings. He always circles back to hope, to God's uniqueness.
Always. He reminds them that God chose them because he loved their ancestors. He is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And the path to a long life in the land is simple. Keep his statutes.
So that leads us right into the core covenant principles in chapter 5, the 10 Commandments.
And Moses makes it personal. He says this covenant at Horeb wasn't just some historical event for their grandparents. He says it was made with all of us living now. He renews the contract with this new generation.
And the structure is clear. The first 4 commandments are about their relationship with God.
Right. No other gods, no images, don't misuse his name, keep the Sabbath. That defines their vertical loyalty.
And the last 6 are about their horizontal loyalty to each other.
Honor your parents. No murder, adultery, stealing, false testimony, or coveting. It's the basic framework for a just society.
The reason for the Sabbath here in Deuteronomy is a little different than in Exodus, though.
It's richer. Yes, it's about celebrating creation, but here he adds that they must observe it to commemorate God's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. It has a dual purpose, God as creator and God as redeemer.
And it was for everyone, even slaves and foreigners.
That was crucial. It was a weekly reminder that they were all once oppressed, and God's rest is for everyone.
Chapter 6 then gives us the absolute core of it all, the Shema.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That is the foundational confession of the faith, the non-negotiable truth.
And flowing directly from that is the greatest commandment.
The one Jesus later quoted. Love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole being, and all your strength.
It's a demand for total allegiance. Mind, emotion, will. The whole person.
And this faith can't be a private thing. It has to permeate every part of daily life, especially through what parents teach their children.
And what's fascinating here is that Moses puts the responsibility for spiritual education squarely on the parents, not the priests.
He does. He says you must teach these words to your children constantly. When you're sitting at home, when you're walking down the road, when you lie down, when you get up. It's about integrating faith into the very rhythm of life.
Even making it physically present, tying reminders on their arms and foreheads, writing them on the door frames.
It's a full spectrum commitment. Sensory, spiritual, intellectual, total saturation. But he ends with a vital warning.
The warning about prosperity.
Exactly. He says, when you get into this good land with its big cities you didn't build and wells you didn't dig and vineyards you didn't plant, you have to be so careful not to forget the Lord.
Prosperity is the final exam.
It's the ultimate test. The danger is that they'll get comfortable and proud and say, my own ability and my own skill got me this wealth. Moses warns that pride is the path to destruction. They have to remember that God is the one who gives the ability to get wealth.
Okay, so that's the theological backbone. Now, in part 3, we get into the nuts and bolts. Maintaining this holy nation with specific laws on justice, governance, and purity. This section is huge, so let's hit the most important parts.
It starts in chapter 7 and 8 by reinforcing why they were chosen in the first place. And Moses is crystal clear. It was not because of merit. He says, you were the least numerous of all peoples.
So it had nothing to do with them being better or stronger than anyone else.
Nothing at all. It was solely because of God's love and his faithfulness to the promise he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a humbling foundation.
And he connects this to the purpose of the 40 years in the wilderness.
He does. He says that time was meant to test you, to humble you, and to teach you one unshakable lesson. Humankind cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the Lord's mouth.
The very same verse Jesus quotes during his temptation.
The very same. The lesson is, if God can sustain you in a barren desert, he can sustain you anywhere. It's the ultimate antidote to pride and self-reliance.
Which brings us to a very difficult topic in chapter 9. The justification for conquest. This requires some very impartial clarity.
It really does. And Moses doesn't leave any room for misinterpretation. He states very explicitly that the annihilation of these nations was not because Israel was so righteous. In fact, he calls them a stubborn people.
So if it wasn't a reward for Israel's goodness, why did it happen?
2 reasons. First, the extreme and long-standing wickedness of the nations already living there. And second, because God was fulfilling the solemn promise, he swore to the ancestors. He was keeping his covenant, not rewarding Israel's merit.
And just to make sure they don't get a big head about it, he makes them recite their own history of failure.
He runs through the whole list. The golden calf at Horeb, complaining at Tabra, testing God at Massa, the failure at Kadesh Barnea. He reminds them that the only reason they weren't wiped out was because he, Moses, interceded for them, arguing for God's reputation, not their own worthiness.
So there is absolutely no basis for spiritual pride.
None whatsoever. Okay, so from there, we move to the practical structures of their society. In chapter 12, we get the principle of the central sanctuary.
Which might sound like just a bureaucratic rule, but it was hugely important for their identity.
It was foundational. All public worship, all sacrifices had to happen at the one place God chose to establish his name, which would eventually be Jerusalem. This was to distinguish their worship from the Canaanites, who had shrines and idols scattered all over the place on various high places. It focused all their devotion on one unseen God.
And we see that same focus on holiness in the rules about blood.
A strict prohibition on eating blood. It had to be poured out on the ground like water because, as the text says, the blood is life itself. It was a way of honoring life and connecting it to the concept of atonement. It's actually the basis for kosher meat preparation today.
Turning to justice, chapter 17 sets up a formal judicial system with an appeal to a higher court.
Right. For the really tough cases that local judges couldn't solve, complex disputes about bloodshed or legal claims, the appeal had to go to the highest court at the central sanctuary, which was made up of Levitical priests and the chief judge.
And their decision was final.
Absolutely final. To reject the high court's ruling was seen as rebellion against God himself, and the penalty was death. It established an absolute legal authority for the nation.
Then we get this radical blueprint for leadership, the King's Constitution. It's really a document about limiting power.
It is remarkably ahead of its time. It puts strict restrictions on any future king to prevent tyranny. First, he has to be an Israelite, and crucially, he's forbidden from accumulating a large number of horses.
Which were the tanks of the ancient world.
Exactly. It was to prevent him from trusting in his own military might instead of relying on God. And it would prevent him from making dangerous alliances with places like Egypt just to get more chariots.
And the personal restrictions are just as strict. No multiplying wives, no hoarding a massive personal fortune.
Right. Multiplying wives, especially foreign wives, was forbidden because it would turn his heart away from God, which is exactly what happened to Solomon. And amassing wealth was prohibited to prevent corruption and exploiting the people.
But his main job was spiritual and intellectual.
This is the key. He had to personally write out his own copy of the law and read it every single day of his life. The goal was to make the most powerful man in the nation the most humble before God's law. He had to be the model Israelite.
Chapter 18 then contrasts that political leader with the spiritual leaders, the prophets and the priests.
The roles are distinct. Priests inherited their office, they taught the law and oversaw the sacrificial system. Prophets, on the other hand, were called directly by God to deliver specific messages, often calling for repentance. They were a necessary check on the religious establishment.
And this leads to that huge forward-looking promise of a prophet like Moses.
Yes, God promises, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, and I will put my words in his mouth. The parallels between Moses and Jesus are deep. Spared in infancy, mediators of a covenant, intercessors for the people.
But the comparison ultimately highlights Jesus' superiority.
Of course. Moses mediated a law that required temporary atonement. Jesus mediated a new covenant through his own blood that brought permanent salvation. Moses set the stage. Jesus was the fulfillment.
But with the promise of true prophets comes the danger of false ones. How are they supposed to tell the difference?
2 simple tests. First, if a prophet makes a prediction and it doesn't come true, he's a fraud. He must be executed. Second, even if he performs a miracle but then tries to lead the people away from the Mosaic law toward other gods, he's a traitor and must be executed. The message had to be consistent with God's established word.
Okay, finally in this session, we get to the civil impurity code, starting with those cities of refuge in chapter 19.
A brilliant legal innovation. 6 cities were designated as safe havens for anyone who killed someone accidentally, manslaughter, not murder. It protected them from the blood avenger, a family member who had the customary right to execute the killer. It was a way to regulate revenge and ensure justice was measured, not just personal vengeance.
And chapter 19 also contains that famous and often misunderstood law of retaliation, an eye for an eye.
Context is everything here. This was not a command for personal revenge. It was a principle for the courtroom, for judges. It ensured that the punishment fit the crime, no more, no less. It was a ceiling on punishment to prevent excessive vengeance.
So Jesus wasn't canceling this law for the courts. He was forbidding it for personal relationships.
Precisely. It was a legal principle of proportionality, and it was also applied to false witnesses. If you lied in court to get someone punished, you received the very punishment you were seeking for them.
The laws about war in chapter 20 are also fascinating, especially the exemptions from military service.
Right. Anyone who had just built a new house, planted a vineyard, or gotten engaged was sent home. But most importantly, anyone who was afraid was sent home, so their fear wouldn't spread. God preferred a small, confident army over a large, fearful one.
But the rules of engagement were drastically different depending on the city.
They were. For distant non-Canaanite cities, they were to offer peace terms first. But for the Canaanite cities within the Promised Land, the command was utter annihilation.
And this is the point that requires the most clarity. Why such a harsh command for those specific nations?
The stated reason was to prevent religious contamination. God declared that their abhorrent practices, including child sacrifice and ritual prostitution, were so corrupting that if they were allowed to survive, they would inevitably lead Israel into apostasy. It was presented as both a divine judgment on those cultures and a radical surgery to ensure Israel's spiritual survival.
Then there's that amazing environmental law. Don't cut down fruit trees during a siege.
It's a sign of foresight. A tree in the field is not human, Moses says. They could use non-fruit-bearing trees for siege works, but they had to preserve the fruit trees for their own future sustenance.
And finally, the family codes, like the law of the rebellious son.
Another one that is often misunderstood. It sounds brutal, but it actually restricted parental power. Parents could not execute their own child. They had to bring him before the community elders, and only if he was a chronic, unrepentant drunkard and glutton could the community execute him. It preserved parental authority but prevented parental violence, and taught that love for God's law had to come even before love for a rebellious child.
So all these codes, from the grand to the minute, are setting the stage for the ultimate choice.
Exactly. Life or death. Which brings us to part 4. The ultimate stakes.
The ultimate stakes. This is laid out in the great reciprocity of blessing and curse in chapters 27 and 28, an entire framework built on direct consequences.
It's a formal ceremony they're supposed to conduct as soon as they enter the land. Blessings pronounced from one mountain, Mount Gerizim, and curses from another, Mount Ebal. There's even a symbolic alignment of the tribes on each mountain.
And the people have to actively agree to the terms. They have to shout, "Amen," after each curse is read.
They do. They have to affirm that the curses apply to secret sins, like making an idol in private, disrespecting parents, moving a neighbor's boundary marker, or perverting justice. It brings everything, even hidden actions, under the authority of the covenant.
If they obey, the blessings are incredible. Exaltation above all nations, success in the city, success in the field. They'll be the lender and never the borrower.
They would be the head and not the tail. But if they disobeyed, the curses were a perfect, horrifying reversal of every single blessing. Sickness, drought, defeat in battle.
And the prophetic warnings about what would happen under military siege they get incredibly graphic.
They are some of the most chilling passages in the entire text. Moses prophesies that a siege will become so desperate that people, even tender, delicate people, will resort to cannibalism, secretly eating their own children out of starvation.
It's an unimaginable horror.
It is, and it's a prophecy that was fulfilled with terrifying accuracy, particularly during the Babylonian siege and, most famously, the Roman siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, where historians like Josephus documented these exact events.
The ultimate curse, though, is being scattered among all nations, the dispersion.
Yes. Moses warns that they will find no rest among those nations, only an anxious heart and despair, the ultimate reversal, being sent back to Egypt in ships to be sold as slaves, and no one would even buy them. It's the complete termination of the covenant blessings.
But the text doesn't end in despair. It immediately pivots in chapter 30 to a promise of repentance and restoration.
This is so important. God promises that after all this happens, after the dispersion, if they are in those distant lands and they reflect and genuinely repent with their whole heart, He'll regather them. He will bring them back.
And He promises something even deeper, a new heart.
Yes. The Lord your God will cleanse your heart, so that you may love the Lord your God with all your mind and with all your being. The text calls it a circumcision of the heart. It's an internal spiritual regeneration that enables true love and obedience.
And this is really looking forward to the new covenant prophesied later by Jeremiah and Ezekiel.
It absolutely is. It's a promise of a fundamental change in their relationship with God. Now, there are theological debates about how this is fulfilled, whether it's future national restoration for Israel or fulfilled spiritually in the church, but all sides agree it points to a divine, transformative act on the human heart.
And this leads to the final emotional appeal, the call to choose.
Moses tells them this commandment is not too difficult or far away. It's right here, in your mouth and in your mind. He lays it out plainly. I have set before you life and prosperity, death and disaster. Therefore, choose life.
For there we get to the final acts of Moses' life in chapter 31, the succession.
Moses, at 120 years old but still full of vitality, formally commissions Joshua in the tent of meeting. And God himself appears in a pillar of cloud and warns Moses that, yes, after your death, these people will break the covenant.
So to serve as a permanent witness against them, God has Moses write a song.
The Song of Moses in chapter 32, it's a powerful poetic testimony. It contrasts God, who is called the Rock, perfect and just with Israel, who he calls Jeshurun, which means the upright one. But he uses it with irony because this upright one will become fat and prosperous and then desert the God who made him.
The song even prophesies that God, in his righteous jealousy, will make Israel jealous by blessing a nation slow to learn, a clear hint at the future inclusion of the Gentiles.
It is. And then we come to the end, chapter 34. Moses' last view and his death. He climbs Mount Nebo, and the Lord shows him the entire promised land, all of it, the whole inheritance promised to Abraham.
He sees it all, but he can't go in. And the mystery.
Moses, the servant of the Lord, dies there in Moab. He was 120, his eyes weren't dim, his strength was not gone. And then the text says God himself buried him in a valley, and no one knows his exact burial place to this very day.
Which is such a significant detail. The fact that God personally handles his burial suggests a unique act of preservation, maybe even hinting at a special resurrection state, like Enoch or Elijah.
It certainly sets him apart, and the final epitaph confirms it. Joshua takes over, full of wisdom, but the last words are reserved for Moses. No prophet ever again arose in Israel like Moses, who knew the Lord face to face.
That face-to-face intimacy, the direct speech, the signs and wonders, it cemented his place as the standard, the definitive prophet until the coming of Christ. Wow, what a deep dive. From the shocking contrast of an 11-day journey taking 40 years, to the paradox of Moses' own exclusion despite his unique relationship with God, to this incredibly detailed covenant that demanded complete devotion. Deuteronomy really lays it all out.
It does. The entire framework is there. God as a loving master, redeemed humanity as his servant, and the absolute requirement of wholehearted allegiance in every single part of life, from the courtroom to the family home.
And as we close out, there's one last provocative thought to leave you with. We talked about that king's constitution. It placed on the most powerful person in the nation the exact same obligations as every other citizen. He had to be the model Israelite. So the question for us is, what does it mean for a modern community to expect its leaders to be not just administrators, but its ultimate moral and intellectual models?
A question about power and piety that is just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago.
Something for you to think about until our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us.
Until next time.
Farewell.